Hello, everyone. I'm Lisa Norberg, Director of the Cooper Union Library, and along with my colleague, Lujaina Abdelawad, Assistant Professor of Economics.
Hi, everyone.
It is our pleasure to welcome you to Preparing Students for a Data-Driven World. Thank you for joining us. This evening's panel was made possible through a Cooper Union grant program. So we would like to begin by thanking Cooper Union President Laura Sparks, the Deans Tarani, Essel, Shoup, and Griffin, as well as the student and faculty reviewers for their generous support. As Lujaina and I described in our grant proposal, it is data that helps us expose structural racism, visualize climate change, and identify the next pandemic hotspot. Data are big and ubiquitous, but they are more than just statistics, software, algorithms, and objectivity. They are narrative, design, personal, and subjective. Regardless of their discipline, we want our students to be able to find, question, understand, manipulate, and communicate data so they can make meaningful contributions to our increasingly data-driven society. And we're not alone.
We're fortunate to be joined tonight by an outstanding group of faculty from a wide range of disciplines for whom data are an integral part of their teaching and research, and who understand the importance of helping students build the empirical reasoning skills they need. Our first panelist, Thomas Augst, is Associate Professor in the Department of English at New York University, where he teaches courses in American literature and culture. He's the author of The Clerk's Tale, Young Men and Moral Life in 19th Century America, and he's co-editor of Institutions of Reading, The Social Life of Libraries in the United States, as well as a 2017 special issue of American Literary History on Archives, which explores the impact of digitization on scholarship and teaching in the field. He is a faculty co-director of New York Spacescapes, a research community dedicated to exploring the literary, historical, and social aspects of New York City using digital forms of scholarship. In his teaching, Professor Augst has explored project-based learning with humanities data and served as faculty co-director of a 5-year summer internship in digital humanities for graduate students sponsored by the Polonsky Foundation. Our second panelist is Kyung Lee, Assistant Professor of Modern Architecture in the Growth and Structure of Cities Department at Bryn Mawr College. She's an architectural historian who studies the relations of mapping architecture and urban planning, and whose work intersects with histories of science, media, theory, and geography. Currently, she's a Bannister Fletcher Global Fellow organizing a program, The Quantification of Urban Space, based on her manuscript entitled The Tyranny of Straight Line, Mapping Modern Paris. Her research also extends to migration histories of built environment. She's currently implementing a project mapping wigs and plywood, Korean migration and the African American urban landscape, in which she investigates the ways through which economic policies of post-war Korea intersected with the urban development of African American neighborhoods in the United States. Our third panelist is Bryn Mayo, Professor of Environmental Science and co-chair of the Environmental Science Department at Barnard College. He's affiliated with the Earth Institute at Columbia University and serves as the campus representative to the Geological Society of America. His affiliations also include the American Geophysical Union, the American Chemical Society, and the American Society for Microbiology. His research is on groundwater microbiology with a focus on naturally occurring arsenic. He has published widely and has taught courses on ecotoxicology, environmental measurements, and water, sanitation, and health and big data, as well as Python for environmental analysis and visualizations. Last but not least, we have David Wyman, Professor of Economics and Faculty Director of Barnard's innovative Empirical Reasoning Center. His teaching spans the interdisciplinary fields of political economy and economic and social history. In 2014, he received the Economic History Association's Horace Prize for Excellence in Teaching Economic History. His current research focuses on the evolution of the US banking monetary system from Andrew Jackson's bank war in 1832 to the formation of the Federal Reserve. Among his most recent publications are Political Limits to the Fed's Goal of a Common National Bank Money, the Par Clearing Controversy Revisited, and Main Street and Wall Street, the Macroeconomic Consequences of New York Bank Suspensions, 1866 to 1914. As the Empirical Reasoning Center faculty director, he has sought to enhance students' empirical literacy by embedding empirical analysis of all types into courses across the undergraduate liberal arts curriculum.
We are also grateful and delighted to introduce two of our Cooper Union colleagues who will be moderating tonight's panel. Cynthia Lee is an assistant professor of civil engineering at the Cooper Union. She received her PhD from Georgia Tech in 2020, and her research interests are in the critical infrastructure, modeling, and community resilience, particularly in urban settings. She teaches first-year engineering design and problem solving, engineering mechanics, and structural analysis. Ninad Padit is a historian, architect, and urban planner. He currently serves as a visiting assistant professor of history at the Cooper Union, where he teaches courses on colonialism, urbanism, and global history. His scholarship examines the relationships between colonial urbanism, industrialization, and the emergence of radical politics in early 20th century Bombay. Ninad has previously held postdoctoral fellowships at Yale University and the London School of Economics and Political Science, where his work was supported by the Andrew Mellon Foundation. Thank you all for being with us. Before we begin, I just want to make a note that if the audience has questions, we'll be taking questions through the Q&A box after our speakers finish their presentations. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Tom.
Thank you, Lisa and Lujana, and I'm really honored to speak with our colleagues here, and thank you, Cooper Union, for the invitation. So to just start off, I wanted to make an observation based on my experience at co-coordinating the graduate student workshop, summer workshop, over the last 5 years with my colleague, an emeritus faculty member in computer science at NYU, Dina Engel. And we worked with some 50 graduate students from 16 different programs. And what we found in the work they were doing primarily on their sort of master's or doctoral projects was that the areas of technical training that they were interested in, sort of, and most in need of, and sort of working on during these summer internships were represented here. And what you see basically is that the largest areas of need here had to do with working with text, web presentation, working with data, and especially GIS mapping. And the simple observation I want to make about this is that all of these students in very different fields were essentially sharing same methodological questions and issues. They were learning essentially the same kinds of tools, and all of them, right, revolved essentially around a paradigm shift in recognizing the centrality of data to their humanities research, regardless of the particular content specialization. And we found that this opened up sort of extraordinary opportunities for cross-disciplinary conversation that literally had not existed before. So this is just a passing observation. And I should say, you know, when I was a doctoral student, the word data, I don't think ever came up with my professors. That was in my training. So a real paradigm shift that we're seeing as a result of the extraordinary tools that are now available to students, scholars, and citizens. I want to make a second sort of passing observation about the relationship between information systems and the platforms and tools we use to access education. This is an image of a sectional image of the New York Public Library right after the flagship building on Fifth Avenue was built. It appeared on Scientific American on the cover in 1911. And the technological innovation here was this automated stack shelving that allowed books to be brought up from the bottom of the library and served up to basically these readers who were requesting access there that you can see at the very top. And one of the points I wanted to make about this is that you know, in a sense, that image is a heuristic for me of the distance we have traveled, the technological change. Obviously, the digital revolution has, in a sense, carried access to all sorts of things, all sorts of knowledge and information, well beyond the traditional bricks and mortar that used to sort of guard and patrol access to knowledge. But there are costs and benefits to this. And so this is a picture of the New York Public Library's search its online catalog here. And a simple point here is that information, bibliographic data that used to be, in a sense, you had to be familiar with in order to even request information has now vanished behind a technological screen. And we are left with these single search boxes. And of course, Google, I don't know what your experience is with your students, but my students, Google's the first place they search to do any kind of research. This brings me to the point problematic that I wanted to make about the impact of these centralizing information architectures that are very much defining our lives as students and scholars and citizens. And we're thinking here about, I think, the problematic of open versus closed systems, right? Dynamics of access and inclusion. We're talking as well about the shift from more vertical structures of authority to more horizontal structures of authority, right? And what that means in terms of how we organize classes, how we teach to different kinds of students that we find in our classrooms. And we're also thinking about passive consumption of data, right, which is the kind of essentially what I'm thinking of when you can type into a single search box and receive output from that. You're actually relying passively on bibliographic data that you used to be have to be informed about, versus a critical data literacy, which is very much what I think we're in need of. I'm just trying to advance my slide. So in answer to the challenge here posed by Lisa for us, how are we preparing students for a data-driven society? My own approach to this has entailed trying to involve students who are primarily English students, humanities students, in the creation and curation of data. It's also been to sort of foster critical and creative reflection about the design and use of data that's informed by learning objectives and materials that are specific to the learning context. There's only so much I can count on being able to do with students in an English seminar related to data. So it really has to do, as a teacher, I've had to think very long and hard and experiment with ways to incorporate data literacy into classes that are essentially about reading, often about reading texts. Final point I want to think that informs my relation to teaching with data is that all data is historical. It's embodied in changing technologies. It encodes narratives which can themselves be forgotten, marginalized, or rendered invisible in new media environments. And the point I was just making about bibliographic data is just one example of that. So I now want to turn to talking about, I thought it would be useful to just do a bit of show and tell about two courses that I taught, and to show you how I was approaching teaching with data and trying to integrate thinking about conceptualizations of data and using data tools in my classes. And this first class was called Urban Atlas. It's called Literary Geographies of 19th Century New York. And this involved, I did a series of different kinds of exercises here, which were basically taking literary texts and asking students to engage in various kinds of activities that essentially use geospatial tools and conceptualizations of geospatial data to marry historical texts from the 19th century with the students' own experience of the contemporary urban environment. And so this was an exercise where they were gathering contemporary data about Edgar Allan Poe's various residencies in New York City. Another exercise that we did in this class was to take a story which you may or may not know, Bartleby the Scrivener, and basically treat it as a means of conceptualizing space. And so this is basically ask students to think about how texts serve as artifacts of urban history, but also as tools for navigating space and time. So what exactly did the office that Bartleby worked in look like? And it's not self-evident actually from the story. And this is also a timeline of a day in the life of Bartleby. Another exercise, which I thought was particularly successful, involved treating Whitman's poem, Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, as itself a data set about the experience of space. And as part of sort of setup of this exercise, I asked students to engage in a collaborative tagging of the poem's spatial and temporal markers, which you can see there on the left. And then in addition, I asked them to do a field work exercise to collect their own experiential data to take a Brooklyn ferry essentially to Manhattan. The real challenge, of course, there is that it's a 4-minute ride, so probably considerably faster than it may have been in Whitman's time, and to write a prose narrative of their experience and to think about how they were basically formatting their experience in a narrative format of experiential data. And then for this class, we did a final project. This was to basically create an urban atlas. And for this, we used Esri's story map platform to produce a digital atlas. And what I wanted to do here was to find a way where students could actually spend a couple weeks developing a kind of intellectual investment in cultural heritage materials. We relied on the Hathi Trust digital repository. If you're not aware, that's an amazing resource. Where they could sort of find all sorts of artifacts and do some guided searching amongst themselves. And for this final project, in using the story map, we basically had each student sort of create their own little collection of images and text, and to curate an exhibition. And at the same time, to be put in continual conversation with one another about what they were doing. So students each took responsibility for one page in the story map, and using it to narrate and to curate and narrate their own collection of sources and texts. But they also formed the departments, an editorial department, a graphic design department, technology department, in order to look at the overall functioning and presentation of Urban Atlas as a whole. And this class, I took the form that it took with these kinds of exercises because I learned, I guess it was December for a spring term class, that most of the students were not English department students. Most of them were actually not even in the humanities at all. And so I found myself, anticipating teaching students in biology and other STEM programs, and realized that what I had imagined doing, sort of traditional reading texts, writing essays about them, would probably be less effective with the particular students that I had in a room. And I wanted to find a way that would leverage tools that are available in order to have these students learn from one another and have intellectual means of engaging the materials that corresponded more to their own interests and skills relative to their programs. And so I now want to talk about a second class. And I'm really thinking here, and I think because I'm a cultural historian, I'm very invested in how we can use the extraordinary resources that are now available through digital archives and libraries. How can we use these to engage students in scholarly research? And so the basic approaches I've been taking to this involve digital archive exploration and artifact discovery. It involves description and contextualization of items and collections, and it involves animating cultural heritage objects for our contemporary moment through multimedia platforms for storing, telling. And all of this essentially begins with being able to describe, right, these collections, these artifacts in terms of the data standards in which they are preserved. And so this brings me to the second class I wanted to talk about. I should note that this class is a class I'm teaching now. So this is a class on slavery, capitalism, and human data. And essentially, this is introducing students to historical contemporary debates about the relation between slavery and capitalism in the United States. What can archives of slavery teach us about the values and practices of capitalism as they emerged in the 19th century? What can diverse formats of information used to document and manage the slave economy teach us about accounting of human and life? And what responsibilities do we assume in reckoning its legacies in our contemporary moment? And a reference point for, in a sense, what inspired the direction this course has taken was the recent revelation in December that Johns Hopkins, the namesake of the university, had in fact owned slaves after being for years mythologized as an abolitionist. And this is a simple example of how a piece of information buried in a historical data format, somehow people forgot about that. And so this class has two parts. The first part I've just finished involves engaging students in conceptualizations about the relation between slavery and capitalism, and reading texts and thinking about how abolitionists were themselves engaged in various kinds of gathering and communicating of data, and in a sense engaging social justice campaigns that involve the mobilization of data for mass audiences. But the second part of this class, which I'm just starting now, so this is in a sense, I'm just telling you what I'm planning to do, involves a digital scholarship lab, and it involves basically engaging students in a research project that I'm engaged with colleagues at NYU as well as the New York Public Library. And the lab component of this class does three things. It introduces, the first involves archive discovery. So it's introducing students to genres and formats of archival records through description and contextualization of financial data that was kept by the Brown brothers as the 19th century ledgers that you can see here. And so what we're doing in the class will be doing some guided searching of archival collections using the New York Public Library's digital collections. It's introducing them to metadata standards that are used in digital cultural heritage, and helping them to think about the kinds of bias that can be built into various systems of information organization, right? Why do some artifacts emerge when you type in something into that search box and other things do not? And how do you get around that? And then finally, I wanted to just, we're doing some critical thinking here about this, how this artifact of accounting, that this is an artifact of accounting practice and standards that fueled the expansion of the slave economy and capitalism more generally, and that we can think about the ledger as itself a kind of example of quantum media, a technology for representing and managing human activity as quantitative data. And you can see Jennifer Wernhermann's wonderful Numbered Lives for that, more about that concept of quantum media. And a second module involves the technological challenges of how do you take this archival record and turn it into a data set. So this is about, and in a sense, asking students to think about what the relationship is between a ledger and a spreadsheet. And this will involve introducing students to processes of optical character recognition, machine reading, as well as the specific data science that's now emerging around handwriting recognition. I'll be involving the students in a crowdsourced transcription to create training data for algorithmic processing of ledger images. And the last point I wanted to make is just that the final component of this lab component of the course is to engage students in dealing with curation and public engagement. How do we make these archives visible? And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Min, would you like to?
Let me share my screen. Okay, let's see. Tom, we have a lot of overlap. It's exciting, actually. How do I? Okay. Yeah, we really have a lot of overlap because some of the references are the same. I'm going to make sure I stay on track. I'm running a program right now at the University of London Institute in Paris on the quantification of urban space. And so Lisa and Luciana's invitation had really perfect timing. So thank you so much for the invitation and to be part of this conversation. So I want to start with a citation from Jackie Wernhermann's book, Numbered Lives, and she makes a really clear and simple statement. And I think that we should begin, it's important to begin here, thinking about how data is produced and used, right? So she writes, there's no data, tracking opportunities, algorithms, or patterns without bodies. And in that study, she discusses, for example, how deaths are counted, who did the counting, how those counts were represented and used. And she traces the counting of death and contemporary practices in our Anglophone world, of mortality tables to the plagues of the 16th century, and how it was predominantly women who were asked to venture out to count, and the peril that they shouldered in doing so. So her basic point is to contextualize the production of data, in this case, numbers. Now, the only point that I would add to this, to her statement, is that there's no data outside of places, spaces, and sites, right? So data is really site specific, even though it purports not to be. It purports to be absolute. So both in terms of, where and how it's produced, the media that supports its use, and where it's accessed, right? Data is site specific. And I really think that that is the point, that's where we have to begin with our students, so that they understand that data is already a mediation of our world, right? It's already an interpretation of representation that is situated in very particular embodied material and spatial contexts. And the purpose is to explain the means and methods of a process of abstraction, and then to explain the ways in which those abstractions are then used to propose, justify, and explain qualities, right? Such as urban policies, affordable housing, social inequality or quality, et cetera. Those arguments are often made on quantitative data, but that quantitative data is not fact, it's not a given. There were ideologies and values that were part of their production. So the other aspect that I want to talk about, and that undergirds any discussion about data, is that the history of quantification and mensuration did not emerge because people just liked to count, right? They came from exigencies to manage and control resources. And it's not a coincidence that large quantification practices coincided with state formation beginning in the early modern period in Europe, as well as with colonizing ambitions through today, right? So starting in the 18th, 19th century, but really through still today. So according to these practices, and especially those related to mapping, they were always tied to military aims. That really, I think that is so important to explain from the beginning. I mean, at least for me, because I'm a historian, but I think in general. So I'm going to be making some really general statements about my discipline in architecture, which means that they're only partly true. And you'll find many other examples that don't correlate to this, but okay, generally speaking, in architecture and architectural history, data has a really broad definition, and it's understood and represented in, I think, 4 basic ways, right? So those 4 things are numbers and their use, for example, in social statistics, census data, etc. The second is graphics, textual, and then experiential and sensorial. So I overlap a lot with what Tom has gone through, and I'll explain a little bit what I mean by that. So this is one example, and I'm using examples of my colleagues, not my own. So this is from Conflict Urbanism, Columbia, which was a project out of the Spatial Lab at Columbia University. And so you'll see that they took these GIS mappers and data visualization people who are in the architecture and planning school. They took data from the registry of victims from the Colombian Civil War, so 50 years of victims, and they visualized this data in a kind of random sample here. So, this is one way in which architects use numbers. They look at population data, census data. In this case, they use a data set from this government registry of victims of this violence. Another way, and this is the same project, I'm using it because I just had a workshop on this on Monday, on Tuesday, so it's fresh. So this is another common example, right? So this is the graphic side. And this includes architectural drawings, urban plans, maps. And at least since the 19th century, all of these maps are based on measured surveys, right? But then you can ask so many questions about this, like what does a line actually represent, right? Especially Lisa mentioned global warming, right? So if you have rising waters or changing coastlines, what does that line on that coast actually represent, right? Is it fixed? Or what is the line of displacement here? What is that actually representing? Et cetera. I don't want to go too much into this, but just to give you a visual, right? Or to think about the measure itself, right? What is a meter? When was it invented? When was it adopted? So these kinds of measures, why do we use a meter over other measures, et cetera, right? So that tells you already that there's an institution that and governments that are behind supporting this kind of imagery. Another example in architecture is textual or archival. This is an example of a dossier related to the sanitation and leveling of a particular area in Paris in 1877. So many architects, architectural historians might look at this for textual descriptions, right? And then another example, which any architecture student will be familiar with, is the experiential and sensorial. To go out and measure a site, to walk it, to look at it, to experience it. And this is just an example that I took from. I follow Martin Delbecchi on Instagram, so I just stole one of his images from his classes because I didn't have any of my own. Okay, so I teach mostly undergraduates at Bryn Mawr College in a department that is really interdisciplinary. We have an anthropologist, an urban planner, historians, geographers, and architects. I realize I can't see the chat while I'm talking, so I don't know. So somebody I only see Lisa on the screen. So if you just want to tell me, I've got 5 minutes left, please, because I realize I don't see the chat box.
You have 2 minutes.
Oh, okay. All right. So I'm just going to show you one quick example from my department, which I was just saying it's really interdisciplinary. We have historians, geographers, and architects. So our curriculum introduces students to a range of methodologies in social statistics, GIS, qualitative methods such as ethnography, history, archival work, as well as drawing, because we have architecture studios. So in this particular context, then the ways in which my department teaches critical thinking around data considers all these forms of representations. And I'm going to just very quickly take you through one example that goes through all of these categories that I've listed. So I'm working on a research project related to wig shops and Korean migration and African-American migration and how they meet. I just posed a simple question to students in a GIS class. How many wig stores have there been in Philadelphia since 1960 to 2000, right? How many have been Korean owned? It was a really, I actually think it works when you pose a question that seems really easy to answer. It took the students about an entire semester to figure out what the answer would be, and they're still not definitive. It's because the categories, right, are not, don't fit into wig stores, right? And they have to do this search. They end up doing archival work. So, they looked at business directories, the yellow pages, the white pages, et cetera. Okay, so for the GIS course, they put together these maps that correlated to census data. And these were, just very basic maps that they used to plot the addresses. And I think just one small comment about this is that I think that these pedagogical issues that we're asking about data follow the work of critical geographers and art historians who have asked us to understand the mediated nature of images, right? Even technical images. So I think we have to look at those disciplines to help us think about data. And as Anne Godluska, a fantastic historian of science and geographer, says, she just said very clearly, maps lie, right? So how do they lie? This is an example that she gives, which is a map from Napoleon's conquest of Egypt. You look at this map, you think, my God, it's so precise, it's so accurate. Look at the detail. The thing is that they actually, it's all lies, right? They didn't have enough time to survey. They were not able to go to most of this terrain. So they just filled it in. But the graphics, right, give us this illusion that it's accurate. And I think that's the deception that we have to, that geographers and art historians have taught us. This is another aerial photograph of, this is one of the first aerial photographs that was taken in World War I. And art historians, again, have made the point that we value photography as a objective eye, when in fact we know from their scholarship that it's not, that things are framed, and even this that was appreciated for its objectivity, and in the end it took an army of people to interpret what was happening because the resolution was so poor. Anyway, my point is just that this was, these images, we can talk about these images in the same way that we can talk about data. The other part of this assignment was archival. So we went through the various archives in Philadelphia to connect images to those maps. And then, of course, there was the sensorial and experiential. Students measured and mapped and photographed many of these spaces. And so with all of that, right, when we got to the redlining maps in Philadelphia, they could understood the ideologies that were behind this, not just in terms of, white supremacy but actually in terms of what does it mean to translate something into a housing price, or what does crime data mean, right? And what does it mean to be mapped on this, right? What is the labor involved in interpreting this? So I think that, the students having an assignment that required them to go through and produce their own data really helped them appreciate the values that are associated with this. Okay, so I know I went over. I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Min. Brian, are you ready to tee it up?
I am ready, and I'm sharing my screen. Okay, so I'm Brian Mailloux from Barnard College, and I teach 3 classes here: first year seminar on sustainability, environmental measurements lab, and big data with Python. Those are my sort of bread and butter classes. I'm going to try to incorporate them into the sort of how I think about data. And my fields are earth science, environmental science, sustainability, and there's just so much data in these fields. There's so much data that we can work with. And when you think about the data, I sort of think about you're collecting data, analyzing data, then presenting it. And I want to go into these sort of 3 steps in more detail. And just I'm trying to show you some nice backgrounds. This first slide, which we'll come back to later, this is blood lead levels in New York, which were mapped by journalists at the census tract level. The next one, now you're just sort of seeing so many types of data. This is Arctic sea ice thickness from this week. But now what do I mean about what to do with data? Traditionally, you think about collecting data, right? You think about going into the lab and collecting data. And here was us going into the field with students trying to get a transect of soil properties. However, now I start thinking about me teach students, that may not be the most important thing anymore. Maybe now it's scraping the internet, finding these other sources, merging them, bringing them together, teaching how to do this. And then you start thinking about analyzing the data, right? You start by teaching people using pencil and paper how to do the math. But there's so much data, you quickly go to Excel. Excel quickly gets overloaded and you start thinking these big data issues of using Python, R, all these GIS programs. So it's like, you think about all these things you start to need to do for analyzing. And then what you can't forget about with data at all is presenting the data. You still need to better talk and present and get your points across. So I think this is a critical thing you have to remember is how do you clearly present that data, right? You have your traditional lab reports, journal articles, thesis work, but now these days you have blog posts, Twitter, Instagram, all these different media. And so I'm just showing a picture here of our students, like us doing our poster projects at the end of each semester to get students talking, incorporating data into everything they do. And then here's an example that I use in my Python class, right? We want to understand CO2 in the atmosphere, right? This is real time, right? Societally relevant data. So we want to get the Keeling curve in. And this is beautiful. You can go to this website at Scripps and you can download the latest CO2 data from the atmosphere. So you can choose your site, you can download it. And so we have CO2 data going back to those first samples in 1960 up to last week. And so we can just pull that data right in and students are learning how to use it and analyze it. And so, for example, I make the students go back and say, okay, let's look at our CO2 when you were in high school. How's that compare to present day? How are things changing? What does this mean? And then here's a more local data set, trying to get in the local community, how it's impacting the local community. And so we were looking at, we used that blood lead map you saw on the first slide to try to think about where in Brooklyn should we look for sources of lead in the environment. And so we had a student-led project where you went and collected soil lead in Brooklyn. This student-led project turned into multiple student theses, a PhD thesis, et cetera, where we looked at lead in backyards and public spaces and all these levels that were shockingly high. And we wrote about it, we presented it. Then this actually got picked up by the local media, by WNYC, who was talking about how to protect yourself, right? So these are all important. How do you go from the collecting to analyzing to then talking about it? And then it comes full circle because now I'm using this data back in my class for data analysis, and students, I think, really see the importance of getting this good, high quality data that's making an impact. So just a quick summary, we're in a data-rich world, right? We need to teach our students how to handle that. We're seeing that across all disciplines now. I think this data really helps to engage students, with the local community, the larger community, helps to see what's needed. And also then, as we're dealing with the data, where you're teaching both skills and knowledge at the same time, where you have to teach the students the skills they need to better ask these questions and analyze the data, right? And I think learning to collect the data is important, but you also have to learn how to analyze the data, which may be more important as you learn where to get this data. And then I think you can never forget that communication across media and platforms is just critical in all aspects. And I'll end there.
Great. Thank you, Brian. David?
So thank you, Lisa, for organizing the panel and for inviting me. And I should also note that Lisa and I were co-conspirators in the development of the vision at Barnard that I'm going to talk about. So my presentation will be a bit different than the others. I'm actually speaking not as an economist, economic historian, researcher, instructor, but actually as an an administrator, actually. I'm the faculty director of the Empirical Reasoning Center here, which, as I was going back through my files, some data that I keep, it's nearly a decade since Lisa and I worked on a proposal that the Mellon Foundation generously funded, that led to at least the earliest incarnations of this institution. So I'm just going to actually time myself so to make sure I stay within the limits. I'm going to just briefly talk about the mission of the ERC, and then some evidence about the work that we've done, but in the classroom and across classrooms and beyond that, and then basically think about the development of divisions like the Empirical Reasoning Center that constitute what I think of as a kind of critical architecture and infrastructure essential for teaching students a kind of data literacy, which is so essential in the world that we're living in. So I'm not even gonna talk very much about what we mean by empirical reasoning. The only reason why I actually included this slide at some point, because I've given a version of this presentation elsewhere, is that I once discovered, and I was informed by the development office at Barnard College, that nobody knew what empirical was. They never had heard the term and didn't understand its relevance. So let me just say that besides the data analysis that Brian and Tom, Min were talking about, we also think it's just important for students to be able to read, evaluate empirical evidence and arguments. And I will give a brief anecdote from one of my own classes. I sort of walked into class early. I was able to overhear a couple of students discussing the readings, and they were just telling me they love the readings for this class. They have so many tables and charts, they can just skip over them and just read the text. So it's just less work for them to do. And I thought, oh my God, we're just not teaching properly because students don't recognize that information, critical knowledge, is being conveyed in various forms, both textual and quantitative, also qualitative evidence as well. So our goal is to try to teach empirical reasoning of various stripes across the curriculum. And the work of the Empirical Reasoning Center is to assist faculty in developing, we think of just modules for their classes, in some cases, more important than in other cases, but to make sure that students, regardless of their majors, their thematic interests, that they encounter some form of qualitative geospatial data analysis in the classes that they're encountering. And I guess, this was partly, again, the design that Lisa and I advocated for, is that if you actually think of it in terms of modules within classes rather than dedicated classes, kind of somewhat perniciously, I guess, I thought, well, students can't then escape, this material in taking their classes. They can't just avoid what they think are the more methodological or data-driven courses in the curriculum itself. And so again, the slide just gives you a sense of the work that we've done. We sort of, and there's some classes that are obvious that would require kind of empirical analysis. Although to be honest, we were surprised when we were teaching in the general chemistry and also the introductory physics classes. But we've also been working with colleagues in history, religious studies, urban studies. So across, as many disciplines as we can drum up interest in. Besides the work that we do developing workshops to complement the curricular material in these classes, we've also expanded our programming to provide additional sort of data analysis, data competence for our students in different domains. So we, teach Excel workshops, again, as a kind of a tool that students would require whatever internships or jobs they might anticipate. We've actually organized workshops for faculty especially to adopt open source software, which, as we discovered during this pandemic period, was absolutely critical so that students can have access to the technologies that they need for data analysis without having to incur huge costs, or in some cases actually transcend the resource limits of their hardware. We've been, providing training for, older adults, actually a lot of alum. A fair number of even retired alum and faculty who have actually taken our workshops, recognizing the importance of acquiring some data analysis skills. And we've been also then working through a new initiative at Barnard called Barnard Engages. We've been working with both our colleagues from the faculty and local nonprofit organizations, and also trying to help them, acquire, organize, analyze data essential to their missions. And finally, some of the main beneficiaries of the Empirical Reasoning Center are the students who work with us, who acquire much more in-depth and sophisticated data analysis skills. And they've been involved in a number of projects that we have been able to support, including, working with Mississippi Low Income Child Care Initiative to develop an online portal, kind of economic insecurity index, and along with a spatial mapping tool, so that the organization can cull data as well, organization and also its members to cull the data to be able to advocate for policies in county and state government. We had a student do work on mapping Harlem, the transformation of 125th Street from what was a mixed residential retail space to an entirely retail space. And recently I was working with an undergraduate to develop a new course that drew on the Measure of America initiative. They actually had a version of that called the Measure of New York. The combination to teach some basic descriptive statistics and spatial analysis by analyzing economic inequality and racial ethnic diversity in New York City. So just by way of, again, our other initiatives, and I'll just talk about one other item that doesn't appear here. The Mississippi Low Income Child Care Initiative results in a website that's still in demo form. This is, if you're interested, the URL, but basically it is the tool that we're trying to create, again, to be able to support the advocacy, research and advocacy work of the organization. And this actually, we also organize a bunch of forums and panels to try to help students realize the importance of data. In this case, it was actually about the 2020 census. This is a somewhat poignant poster because if you look at it, it's still on my door because it was actually like right before we shut down. And there's so many things in my office are pretty much dated from March of last year. Last, just to conclude, when I think of it as infrastructure, it's a shared facility to enhance learning and training across beyond the institution. And let me just specify or elaborate on this one point, is that with the ERC, we basically complement the role of instructional staff, in the classroom itself, which could be the professor or teaching assistants, that are helping in the course, that they can rely on our staff to be able to assist students in their empirical analysis, and thereby be able to actually expect more of their students and enhance the education that they're providing. And in addition, we actually work with many faculty who themselves are novices when it comes to data analysis, empirical reasoning. And so we enable them to be able to kind of venture into this domain. And in many cases, a lot of the faculty themselves have become, participants in our workshops, acquiring the same sort of training as their students. So I think I'll just end here.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all our panelists for sharing their experience and insights. And I'm going to turn it over to our moderators to ask some questions.
Yeah, to echo Lisa, thank you all again very much. I thought all of your presentations were very interesting. And I think the underlying theme I've seen and I agree with is just that it's very important to make sure that data analytics is really incorporated into a lot of our different classes. One question that popped up, I think while Min was talking, so maybe Min can start us off, was do you evaluate the quality and integrity of data you analyze? And maybe I'll add on to that, how do you go on then to, and I think you started to talk about this, how do you go on to really emphasize looking for quality data to your students in class?
That's such a good question. You know, it's actually something that I am trying to think about for an assignment, actually, to teach students about how to evaluate their own data that they are producing, that they are gathering and aggregating. So if any of the other panelists have ideas, I'm really game, because you guys are great experts in this. In terms of just that one assignment on you know, identifying the wig stores in Philadelphia, I mean, basically, I went through and evaluated them. The students had to keep a journal of how they were counting, what categories they were using, et cetera. And so they had to journal through, and you know, I went through it with them. So it wasn't a replicatable process in that instance.
Thanks, Min. Did anyone want to add on to that?
I was gonna say, I think that's always a critical part. And I think that's part of what you're learning. Just the more you use data and work with it, the more you sort of become comfortable with asking those questions and looking at the quality. So that's why sometimes it's good to create your own data. So this way, when you're looking at other people's data sets, you sort of have that, you have that sort of intuition and feel, and then you know which statistics to use, et cetera.
Thanks. That was really incredible set of presentations. And I just as a sidebar, if people have any questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box, and I think we will pick them up. But while we're waiting for some questions, I thought I can also get us started. One thing that came up, I think, in a lot of your presentations was this idea that there is data, and then we have to ask questions of that data. I think that each of your presentations had that, and that question that we ask is really important. And one of the things that that Tom started us off with was the idea that that people actually go to Google to ask questions. And so what we end up with is this sort of pre-digested data, right? So and a lot of work actually has been done, you know, concerning, for example, teen pregnancy or people who are contemplating self-harm, where they put in information, and then you kind of get this pre-digested information, which may or may not be accurate, right? And I think that's kind of the way in which we interface with the data. So that image from NYPL was really, you know, useful, because that is, you know, that is the kind of, I was at the cusp of that when I was in grad school, that kind of data, it was transitioning into the online format. And I was just wondering, as a project of teaching and a pedagogy and in the classroom, how is it, what might teachers, all of us actually, how might we help our students recognize that problem, and then also try and think very seriously, and as a function of working with data, learn how to ask good questions of the data set?
I'll say one thing that sort of goes towards that is there's two different approaches I sometimes take with students. It's like, right, what's your question, and then getting the correct data to answer that question. But that's one way to go about it. Another way is you have this data, can you use it to help answer an important question? So sort of like two ways to sort of, I think, go towards what you're saying. And I think they're both really important to do and practice. and make sure you're sort of getting towards the correct answers.
On this one, I also think it's useful when when students, collect and even begin to, analyze in a very, preliminary way, visualize the evidence in some fashion. The question, I always ask them is, do you, if you observe something, is there some other context that will help you to see whether that actually, is relevant? This sort of, is it, for example, just an outlier in the data, or can you find corroborating, evidence, qualitative as well as quantitative, that would give you greater confidence that in the information that you're observing at that?
I mean, I think I'm going to echo some of the things that have already been said, but if you give students assignments that ask them to produce their data, what they're going to learn totally on their own are all of the biases and assumptions that go into making those decisions, right? And what counts as data. So I think that's what is really a key place to start, so that they have to confront those choices and they understand that, the most basic point, which is that data is not given. So I'm just echoing the others.
Right. I mean, I think that the point that Min, you specifically also made right at the beginning of your presentation was that the production of data and its collection, its storage, and its access, that itself has its own political history. It is deeply rooted in kind of history of modern society and comes with all of those problems. So when we actually say that we don't have certain kinds of information, for example, about healthcare data, about certain groups of people, there is actually a longer and more interesting history about why that data was not collected or why was it classified in a certain way. And I think it's, it speaks to two parts. One is the question of, what kind of data is available. And then the other, which is the threshold of accessing data for institutions, can actually become really expensive. So, maybe Columbia or could afford, or NYU could afford certain data sets, but maybe a Cooper Union or Bryn Mawr might not, right? And that affects the kind of work that the students are able to also do, or the kinds of questions that they're able to ask, because of these restrictions, which are really outside the scope of, beyond a certain point, outside the scope of these institutions.
Yeah, I think you're right. I have a colleague in my department, Lauren Restrepo, who works on urban development in Western China. And for her, getting data and the classes that she teaches on that, I mean, there are blind spots, like physical blind spots in the satellite imagery, right, that she has to account for. So I think you're raising such a great point. And if the more that students are aware of this, and also that these are not universals, like think, for example, how in France, they don't have race data, right? Because race it's not a social category, right? So how are you going to talk about race and do analysis on that? And just so that if students get exposed to doing this kind of comparison and the impossibility of comparison, right? I think they start to realize that this data is based on particular values.
And I would just say, asking, the naive question of like, where did this data come from, and what were its motives? What can we learn about sort of the origin story of the data? Right. And so I think data is always captured at some moment, or it's always in time somewhere. So there's always gonna be a history. Now, whether it's visible or not, is a different question. But I think that's maybe a starting point for students I often deal with. They tend to be students who have self-selected into a world where they don't have to think critically about data at all. So in some sense, what Min suggested about like, well, you try to produce some data here, and let's talk about what you do with it, how you'd structure it, that at least gets them into a position where they're not simply taking for granted as passive consumers whatever is coughed up on the search box, and understanding, right, that they're organizational systems that mark things and make them, that allow you to find them in systems of all kinds.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think in the current environment, I mean, these issues are front and center in our ability to be able to, and particularly to track the pandemic. And so we're organizing a forum with three of the volunteers who are the kind of leads in the COVID tracking project. The idea that the Atlantic magazine had to enlist a bunch of volunteers to be able to collect and display, evidence on the pandemic, precisely because what had previously been thought of as reliable sources of information were now being co-opted by political forces that sought to manipulate the evidence in order to kind of, convey another important, political message. So, it strikes, it sort of raises the question ultimately, about the source of the data. And the fact, eventually they disbanded because now they believe that, the data collection analysis has been institutionalized in a form that we can, trust more than, than previously. But it is a pretty stark realization of our reliance, on a variety, in this case, of government institutions that may not always be immune from, say, political influence.
I'm going to go ahead and ask one of the audience questions then. Someone was wondering how you would describe the baseline level of data literacy you expect from your students, and then maybe also what you see when they take your classes.
Yeah. So I will just chime in right away, just say that the very origins of this, my interest in developing this Empirical Reasoning Center emerged when I was teaching at Queens College. And this was the period in which, the IT revolution was now invading, printed media, and led to a kind of revolution in the production of newspapers and other, print forms, so that they could more readily produce tables and charts that now we find, pretty commonplace in almost any media that we encounter. And I realized as I was teaching economics and sort of teaching, more abstract modeling, at the same time, we just weren't doing our job because students couldn't pick up a newspaper and understand the information that was being, communicated, whether it's textually or empirically. And so it struck me that, my goal at least was to make sure our students can actually read articles that rely on tables and charts and the like, and be able to understand how that evidence relates to the textual themes that are being also conveyed in the piece itself. And so it's a pretty, I'm not say a low bar, because I don't think it is a low bar, but it really is, really goes to the heart of at least what, we think of as the mission of the liberal arts education, which is to, teach for citizenship. And citizenship now requires this kind of capacity to be able to kind of comprehend, to digest this information.
Thanks. I'm going to continue the audience question. There's a lot of them actually. So, we're going to try and make our way through as many as we can. So this is, I'm going to briefly read a part of this question, and then, maybe I can paraphrase. It starts, this is a question from Kate Nichols. The OED gives two competing, excuse my cat. The OED gives two competing senses of data. One is an item that is chiefly numerical, an item of information, and the second is something that is given or granted, something that is known or assumed as fact, and something that is the basis of reasoning. So the first one, of course, just seems like it's information, which is, just information. It's like a data point. And the second, of course, is more charged, because it is about the fact that data itself is the basis of the definitionally, it is the basis of analysis and reasoning. And the question is then that we seem to be stuck as scholars, all of us, in various ways, not only on this panel, but just in our work as well. We seem to be stuck between these two competing senses, and what the person asking the question is describing as a dangerous pull of these competing, where we choose what we want to believe in. Whatever makes sense for the project that we're working on, we pick a side. And in that sense, within that kind of framework, what do we and our students, where do we and our students find agency in relationship with the concept of data? Is the idea of data, or the word data, even a useful concept given its history? And is there an alternative way of conceptualizing data as well because of that?
That's such a rich question. I feel like there's an entire seminar in that. Maybe I'll address part of it because I think that there's so many different themes. I think that, well, I don't know if this is going to answer even, well, let me just start. I think that one issue that this question or comment raises is and this is something important that to discuss with students, but also in everyone's research, I think, right? What are the accepted values of the data that you are using, right? So one example that I can give to kind of concretize what I mean is that when the meter was invented, right? When it was the idea of a meter being 1/10 millionth of the meridian of the earth, that was a political decision, right? It wasn't a scientific decision. It was a political one. It was Condorcet and Talleyrand in France saying, you know what, we need to figure out a way for people to have transactions, no matter who they are, that are not localized, that are not based on very local, personal, anthropomorphic transactions, right? It was an economic decision. It was about changing tax laws so that they could raise more money and measure property in a different way that was more uniform, right, to create this standard. And so they built an entire infrastructure, right, a government bodies to sustain the idea of a meter. And here we are today where we still believe that the meter is a valid measure and we accept it, right? And we accept that as our reality. And I think that when we think about data and we teach that, that's what we're trying, or at least that's what I'm trying to teach my students, that we decide as a society to accept some norms, right? And some definitions so that we can interact with each other. Okay, fine. What are those norms, right? Can we talk about what those norms are in terms of not just the meter, but in all sorts of other measures and ways of analyzing things, gathering information, what have you. I don't know if that answers that question.
I was going to do the same as you. That's too much of a question to answer. Like I can't, right? But it's but I was going to say one thing. It is, you have to remember we all bring biases to our analyses and our data, right? And so that's always a hard thing. We all have these, like, and that's what you're trying to do as a scientist, is to remove them. But it's like we know we can't. So it's like how to try to be the most open with utilizing the most data to come to the best answer. But you have to, right? It's a hard thing to do, right? We're all, right? You just keep trying to improve and do better.
There was a question from an art school alum, a Cooper Art School alum. Someone was wondering if you see where all of this applies to communication between generations and to disciplines like philosophy or in civic engagement. And I think that's kind of a lead into what we've already been talking about.
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry, Cynthia.
Yeah, so I mean, someone was asking where you see all of this in terms of data analytics applied to communication between generations when we talk about teaching data analytics in the classroom, and also to disciplines like philosophy or civic engagement. So still in that same line of interdisciplinary work and teaching.
I'll just, in terms of the civic engagement, I mean, our experience at the Barnard ERC has been that teaching data analysis and civic engagement are complementary in that many of the organizations that say my colleagues are partnering with in the community are, eager to be able to, access information that they feel can help them with their mission, whatever that might be. Some of that information is quantitative forms of data. And so, we work within our colleagues and these organizations to try to give them the skills, but also, give them at least suggestions for how to search for the data that they might find useful in essentially carrying out their mission. So, they seem quite open to it. In some cases, one reason why we involve ourselves is precisely because they can't afford the staff to be able to do that work and kind of through their own internal research department. And so, one thing we can do as academic institutions and working with community members is to be able to assist them in learning how they can best advance their ends through acquiring and analyzing a variety of information.
Can I just say one quick thing? Because I really love what David is doing at this ERC. I think it's so fantastic. I feel like it should be at every school. There should be an ERC, like a writing lab. There should be an ERC at every school.
Amen,
I love it.
amen to that.
No, but I think one of the reasons why, and this is to answer the question that Cynthia read out, which is that I think students are, and people who are younger than we are much more media savvy. I mean, even my 2-year-old can manipulate things better. It's crazy, but they're much more media savvy. It doesn't mean that they're much more data savvy. What I think is really encouraging is that I find at least my students to be so open to these questions, right? And so open to so willing to engage with this. And I don't know if it's because of the awareness that's come out of the BLM protests or, but just in terms of the political moment, which brings me back to what David is doing with ERC. It's not just about critical engagement, right? It's about democratic ideals, right? Ideally, in an ideal world, our universities and our colleges are meant to be a free space to model democratic forms, practices, right? And I think one of the very fundamental things is to be able to critique, to understand, question the very basis of those democratic practices or civic practices, one of them being data, right? It could be other things too, but this is just the topic of our panel today. So I think it's any time that we're teaching students to think about how they're consuming data and how they're also being consumed through data, that's part of our jobs in a democratic society, period.
Yeah, and I would add just that it is a question of literacy in a sense, and so really thinking about where and when are students being trained as citizens, right, in how they consume and in how to sort of responsibly and critically engage data, especially given the authority that data comes to wield in our collective lives. And I keep thinking about this point that David was making about students turning the pages that had graphs on them, or the graphic presentations of data, say, well, I don't have to read that, which it seems to me is an example of the kind of, in a sense, the persuasive or rhetorical force that the graphic presentation of data often has, because it's not, in a sense, textual. And so, how at the very least, right, stopping them from turning the page and saying, okay, no, what do you see on the page? Explain to me exactly. Let's have a conversation about what we see. Do we see the same thing that's represented in this representation of data, right? And so that kind of conversation, it seems to me, that you would have either across disciplines or across generations, where you are putting numbers or graphs or what have you into narrative and into exchange between citizens, whatever they're talking across or between. It seems to me is is a necessary skill that citizens need to have. It doesn't mean it's easy to do, and people are many people are afraid to talk about data, interrogate data. They much prefer to trust data. And so I think, and I agree with Min's point, just that I think there is a kind of a greater appetite or facility for this amongst, the rising generation, although, facility with media can often work against critical thinking and reflection, right? So it's, in a sense, slowing down the ease with which they manipulate, navigate, and move across media, and getting them to pause right before they turn the page, I guess, is the trick here.
Thanks. That is just hits so close to home to me as well, because I also teach with data, and it's always like, oh my God, like revenue collection in Bengal increased by 25% in 2 years. Isn't that amazing? That tells us such an interesting story about colonialism. And then the answer is just shrugs. Sometimes not. But I just wanted to finish. I suppose this is perhaps the last question that we can take from the audience. I'm going to paraphrase a few because I think that there is a pattern, and I think segues nicely into this question, which is that as teachers, have all of you sort of have any of you observed any patterns in the kinds of questions students are asking, and have they been following, for example, larger kind of political or social stories in the US or the world, or are they following certain trends in scholarship itself? And I was wondering, to what extent are you seeing that sort of in the classroom, the kinds of questions that are getting asked? Has that changed? Is that something that you find dictates the way you teach, or the way you're designing a syllabus, or is that something that is sort of largely remaining in the realm of the independent project that the students might take up?
I can go first. I would say the students have been pushing for, and I've been trying to help supply just more relevant data, like especially more in local environmental justice relevant things that are happening today. They really want to get engaged with that data.
Yeah, I just want to say I agree with Brian on this one. I think at the end of last year, as the end of the spring semesters, we're scrambling just to be able to complete our classes. I was trying to locate some, recent research on the great influenza, otherwise known as the Spanish flu. And, I was reading this stuff over, and I said to the students, I said, this is a very depressing story, but it's got an important lesson that is relevant today. And we can either have we can end on a depressing note, or maybe sort of see, do we get some lessons from history? I mean, they were willing to, venture forward into the, kind of the sad story of what we might learn from historical experience. So I was sort of impressed by that. I thought we could have sort of, there were a number of other topics I could have actually finished the class on, but they, as Brian was saying, they really want to see information. They want to see topics that, as much as possible, since I'm a historian, much as possible, speak to the current moment.
I mean, I agree with what Brian and David had said. I mean, one thing that for me though is kind of, the students are much more focused on the US and US history, US politics than ever before. I find that actually really troubling. So although there's of course a lot to study in the US and a lot happening right now, I think it's something that I try to work against, try to have them focus on other parts of the world. But yeah, I think I would agree. It's a lot of the current politics, a lot about social inequality, a lot about the US is what, at least in the past year, what has been the focus.
Yeah, and I think it was Min who said this earlier. There was a writing center for data, or but I think there are ways we can sort of help our students as in terms of curriculum and requirements, right? I think many universities, liberal arts programs have quantitative reasoning requirements, and how we can help our students start to cultivate their skills as readers and writers of numbers as well as words, and to understand how the interaction between this is so essential to how they're going to be navigating their civic responsibilities. It's a very, but our students are, they like to burrow into their interests as well. So, in a sense, yeah, I'm not sure what else I wanted to say about that, but it's a challenge.
It's almost an aside, a point to what you just said, Tom, with the notion that the quantitative reasoning requirements that many institutions have would help to develop students, kind of data literacy, for example. And, one of the reasons why we chose the title Empirical Reasoning was because we really wanted to focus on the data literacy part. And because Barnard actually's quantitative reasoning was equally could have been a course that was more in the math department or statistics department, and not necessarily the data analysis. And so that's why I think, both of these are important domains of knowledge and understanding. And the question is, are we paying enough attention to what I'll call the empirical side, just not just the quantitative side?
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to call it an evening, but I want to thank our panelists for their experience and insights. It was just an incredible and engaging evening. My thanks to Ninad and Cynthia for moderating tonight's panel. And thank you all for sharing the evening with us. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but hopefully we will continue this conversation in other venues. Thank you all. Have a very good night. Bye-bye.